do what Lisa just. Okay, and introduce them. So let me start with Leslie. Leslie Berns creates bodies of work that spring from everyday utilitarian sources and materials. In Bookmarks for a Mixed Race Narrative, Who Could and Couldn't Marry Whom, she uses wood leveling sticks, oil and chalk pastel to graphically interpret and critique anti-miscegenation laws of the several states, 1932, a historic document that she encountered on the internet. Her visual and written memoirs were recently published in the Earth of anthology, the culmination of a virtual residency for writers and artists with arts, letters, and numbers. Berns has exhibited with the Washington Projects for the Arts, the Hirshhorn Museum, Cultural DC Flashpoint Gallery, and elsewhere, both nationally and internationally. Following her return to the US after living and working in Germany, she was a lecturer in art at the University of Maryland. Leslie currently divides her time between the metropolitan Washington, D.C. area and upstate New York. She earned an MFA from Yale University and a BFA from Pratt Institute. Barbara F. Kendrick, Professor Emerita, School of Art and Design, University of Illinois, received her BA from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and her MFA from The Ohio State University. She has exhibited her work in France, England, and Greece, as well as throughout the United States. She has received fellowships from the Millay Colony, McDowell Colony, Henry Luce Foundation, and Virginia Center for Creative Arts. Residencies include Yaddo, Yentl, Ragdale, Bemis, Fundacio Artigas, Spain, and the Buren College of Art, Ireland. She has received grants from Illinois Arts Council, Shirley Holden Helberg, Mid-American Arts Alliance, and the Pollock Krasner Foundation. On her work, Kendrick writes, I am a visual scavenger, always on the lookout for a thing that looks like another thing. Patterns in wood grain look like eyes, mouths, hair, water. The reflection in a teacup looks like a map. A map looks like an anatomical drawing. The drawing of a spine resembles a fern. I collect images from books, catalogs, internet searches, museum websites, and photos I take on my daily walks. So now, without further ado, I think we will turn to the artist. The format is just that we're going to hear from Leslie and Barbara individually. They're going to share some images with us. So if you're not already familiar with their work, you can see what their practice is about. That'll be, 7 or 8 minutes each. And then after that, I will start out by asking a couple of questions of the artist, and then we'll turn to audience Q&A. And so I invite you at any time to use the Q&A function to jot down your question. If you're, if they're saying something and it's generative and you want to get it in there, you don't have to wait until the end. And then when we get to the Q&A portion, we can start reading those. So I will go ahead and start with Leslie. If you want to share your screen, then we'll get started.
All right, I'd just first like to say thank you to everyone, Lisa, Paula, Barbara, and everyone involved with the show. It's really great to be here. And I will go full screen and start with the piece that is in the show. Books, Marks, Sticks and Bricks, Mixed Remixed, 1932 to 2032. I made it a year ago, actually, during lockdown in this room. Wood shims, leveling sticks, carpenters and builders use to level and make floors and windows even. Black oil pastel, a tar-like sticky material, thickly, opaquely covering the wood in fractions, whole, half, quarter, eighth, 16th, et cetera. As the oil pastel dries, it takes on a beautiful, matte, rich, velvety quality. The piece begs to be read from left to right like a book. It's similar in scale to most books. And the first part is reminiscent, I'd say, of a bar graph. Viewers may ask, what sort of information might these measuring sticks be quantifying? The thicker ends of the shims at the bottom are all at the bottom. So that results in a plane that slopes towards the top, that at the top slopes towards the ceiling, and at the bottom sort of juts out away from the wall. In the second panel here on the left, the bar graph has been rearranged, one could say remixed. Every other measuring stick is turned upside down, which results in a more level plane in this second panel. In this third piece here on the left, sorry, one second. Here on the left, the markings, the lines are arranged in the same order as in the rearranged prior panel, but the shims are now stacked and glued together and form a more three-dimensional volume, a brick of sticks, if you will, with a new pattern. And then the fourth piece is simply made up of several of those bricks, which creates a yet larger volume and an expanded version of the new pattern, which was totally unexpected, this pattern. But when it emerged, it reminded me of the chromosome painting that I received in my Ancestry.com report. Speaking of books and of ancestry, the piece can be traced to a visual memoir, a series of collages I made years ago after my mother died. The zoomed out view here shows the small intimate scale of each collage set against a larger black and white background. When I was arranging my mother's funeral, I discovered a timeline of stamp-sized snapshots of herself she'd cut and pasted to the inside of a hidden away she'd pasted to the inside of a hidden away file folder. I thought of it as a kind of a rough draft of a visual autobiography that she'd never shown me or anyone, and it found its way into this first collage. I think I read somewhere that one of the tasks of grief is to forge a new identity. I discovered while working on this that my grief was all wrapped up with inchoate questions around race and ethnicity, issues I'd always brushed aside. But as if once and for all, I committed to resolving my periodic personal psychological identity struggles in relation, I hoped, to a broader social context. The collage in the center includes small-scale copies of time-lapse drawings I drew of an amaryllis flower at different stages of its life cycle. And in a matrilineal timeline, photographs of my grandmother, my mother as a child, my mother as a mother, myself as a child, my mother as a grandmother, myself as a mother, my daughter. And in this one, amidst color chips from a cosmetics chart of various skin tones from a women's beauty magazine, 2 photographs of my mother taken 40 years apart, 1964 and 2004. Much later, I added the text, a jumbled order of terms, some usually considered offensive, dating from the 16th to the 21st century to describe my mother's and my maternal grandparents' Jamaican, mixed race, African and European ancestry. The title of the series, You Don't Look, You Look, a memoir, stems from what people have actually said to my mother or to me. You don't look, fill in the blank here. Or I hope you can see the text is quite small. You don't look, fill in the blank, or you look, fill in the blank here. Various ethnicities and nationalities, all of these actually incorrect, sort of an example of the ways in which the social mirror identifies or misidentifies based on phenotype or race, ethnicity, nationality. Much later, I took this photograph of the first collage to recreate and document a moment that occurred when I began working on this first collage. I cut out the piece of paper in my hand when I was making the piece. I cut this piece out. the piece that I'm holding in my hand. I cut it out from the cover sheet. I was about to throw it away, but its black rectilinear architectonic shape, its elegant proportions reminded me of a bookmark. A voice inside my head said, hold on to it. So I did. I kept it and I set it aside on my work table. Bookmarks ended up signaling for me the beginning of a decade of reading mixed race narratives and researching American, African American, and Caribbean British histories. These were stories I'd never encountered until my mid-20s. Studies not adequately or critically taught in my schooling, however, essential puzzle pieces to understanding the puzzle of identity in relation to history. I started by rereading a book I'd first encountered as a graduate student way back in 1985, and an autobiography of an ex-colored man written during the Harlem Renaissance, published in 1912. A fictional autobiography set at the turn of the 20th century after the end of slavery amidst the rigidly segregated worlds of Black and white. This coming-of-age novel probes the psychological aspects of passing for white, but also examines the American caste and class system. I quote unquote bookmarked and highlighted the passages that had as if leapt off the page at me when I'd encountered it for the first time. I'd encountered an internal voice expressing feelings and experiences similar to my own, and finding those words represented on a page for the first time. Some information outside of the frame of the work. As I began reading more and researching more about mixed race identity, I came across this legal document on the internet drafted by the Commonwealth of Virginia. There's the title at the top. The 5 portrait ink drawings are of individuals classified according to their blood quantum. It's a handwritten document, something about the fact that it's so, like it's so different from how we, things are printed now. This was handwritten, hand painted drawings. So it's not very legible, but I've highlighted it so that it is. On the left, 5 individuals classified according to their blood quantum. Negro from Virginia, that's the words underneath that I've highlighted. Mulatto, half, quadroon, 1/4, octoroon, 1/8, 1/16, composite, pass for white, American type. And over on the far right, I can't see myself. It says no Negroid mixture, all Caucasian descent. So also in the fine text below, it refers to not only Negroes, individuals, the term of the era, but also Malay, as in Asian, and Indian were all required. It was all against the law for all of those people of color to marry a Caucasian person. So gazing at this gave me my bearings. It was like bumping up against this external pole of legislation, this document. It just totally unambiguously clarified how whiteness and non-whiteness had been constructed. I began to visually interpret and graphically convey the so-called architecture of these anti-miscegenation laws with my bookmarks. And the architecture of the one-drop rule, also known as the rule of hypodescent. If even one drop of colored blood makes you or designates you as quote unquote colored, excluding thus excluding non-whites from marrying Caucasians. So I started out doing it in black and white bookmarks in this sort of binary, either or racial order. And then I tried it again. I did it again with tonal bookmarks. And then I put them all together, the black and white with the tones sort of sandwiched between the layers of the black and white bookmarks. And here are, the portraits, but listed below here were the states in which it was illegal for interracial marriages at certain times. So that's what's listed below here. And so, this document, I quite literally translate it here in a way with the bookmarks. Oh, and I also wanted to say here that, the tile-like pattern that emerged undulates back and forth across a color line, as you can see here. For me, this is a very familiar space, a space that embodies not only a difficult and complex legacies, but also a dynamic space of fluidity, a democratic space of mutuality, and a space that represents a non-binary, non-dualistic way of thinking and being in the world. And I ended up distilling that graphic translation even further into a more abstract iteration here, and went back to working with the black and white palette. And I ask you to consider, these materials as metaphors, the metaphor of the material of wood. The word wood stems from the Portuguese word madeira, which stems from matter, material, and becomes the word mother. And I work with black oil pastel, which is sticky and beautiful and velvety and rich. And I also work with the white powdered chalk pastel, which was an unexpected choice. I thought I was picking up a piece of white oil pastel when I was working on it, but to my surprise, I'd actually picked up a piece of white powdered pastel, which is very, delicate. It easily flakes off. But the two, like water and oil, I've mixed them together. I'm trying to sort of make the viewer in a way see all three simultaneously, to see this space of gray. And I think I'll end here with the windowsill where I made the piece in the show during lockdown on what I call my sill studio, when we were locked down and I was, just working on a very small space. And now I'm working on another piece that's similar, but a little different than the one at the gallery right now. This one includes the white pastel, and the pastel is spread across the wood. And I'm starting to think of it more in terms of a kind of a use of light, dark, chiaroscuro. So I think I'll end there. I hope I didn't go too far over, but let me stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Barbara.
Leslie, thanks so much. It's fascinating to see all of the research that went into that project. Barbara, if you're ready to share, then we'll move on.
Yes. I want to also thank everyone, Paula, Leslie, Lisa, for including me in the show and in this opportunity to show my work. Now, let's see. Okay. I'm moving you over there. Okay. Here I am, dressed and draped in my wrinkled skin. My face is pasted on an image of a marble sculpture, a self-portrait with the immortality of marble and the deterioration of flesh. I started this project, one I call Fleshed Out, 6 years ago with two questions. One, if I made self-portraits at the age of 83, what would they look like? And two, a question that is often a starting point for new work. What wouldn't you want to see? As a culture, we have an aversion to looking at the wrinkled truths of aging. If you Google wrinkles, there will be hundreds of ads for creams and treatments to help us get rid of them. This current work is a new chapter in a career in which I have often confronted taboos of society and the body. The images I am showing are all digital collages, archival inkjet prints ranging in size from 11 by 14 to 20 by 26 inches. Women my age are nearly invisible in a youth-oriented anti-aging culture. We're afraid to see bodily evidence of deterioration and decay. To confront these fears, my fears, I clothe marble busts in the skin we would prefer to erase or veil, offering my perspective on the representation of aging women. Marble lasts, flesh doesn't, giving me my necessary condition for making art, one that incorporates and celebrates contradiction. When I say, as a culture, we have an aversion to looking at the wrinkled truths of aging, I include myself. I find my aging skin both repulsive and fascinating, so I flaunt it. Substituting photos of my wrinkled flesh for smooth marble drapery on images of portrait busts and statues. In place of a statue's face, I paste an image of myself. Photos of my wrinkled neck, hands, and arms become stuff to work with, a material I manipulate in Photoshop to use as drapery. My sagging, crepey skin mocks the perfection of marble, becoming a bold, vulnerable, often humorous confrontation with the evidence of aging. The sources for the sculptures that I use come from photographs that I take in museums in Chicago, New York, London, Paris. And I also find examples of high-res images from museum online collections, such as the Getty, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or the Rijksmuseum. Intrigued by dramatic possibilities, I started seeking out mythological characters, rewriting old narratives, becoming an actress, adding a performative aspect to my work. As Lita, whoa, sorry, I need to go back. No. All right, too far. Anyway, how do I get back?
Maybe your top arrow there.
Wait a minute. Yeah, wait. Okay. Going to,
Barbara, I think if you use the arrow keys on the keyboard, you could go backwards.
okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry about that.
No problem.
As leader, I stick my thumb in the swan's eye. My Medusa is not resigned to her fate, but angry at her transformation. She was punished, not Poseidon, because he seduced her in a sacred place, Athena's temple. I take on the role in my wrinkled skin, with my wrinkled skin, clothing the character I choose. Draping over her torso, sliding over her hips. I enjoy playing with the old question about collage. Which is the real thing here? My arthritic hands prevent me from making sculpture, so I'm pleased I can use digital media to make my impossible sculptures. Impossible because I never had the skill to carve in marble, skin so very wrinkled and draped. My fantasies also include seeing these images produced in a book about 19th century sculpture, slipped in as though they belonged.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Barbara.
Thanks.
Great. So thank you both for those insightful presentations. It was great to see, I mean, I'm familiar with the work that you put in the show, but it was great to see other works that you've both done as well. So, something that has struck me as really wonderful about the exhibition line that Lisa Austin put together is the way in which it links and puts artworks in dialogue with one another in just really unexpected ways. And so, I mean, I think Leslie and Barbara, on the surface, your works look radically different. I mean, Barbara, you're working in this collage process. The work is figurative. It's very legible as these fractured, fragmented bodies, whereas Leslie has developed this very kind of rigorous abstract language. But then in hearing both of you talk about your work, and then from my, reading about your work and writing about it, it strikes me that you both have these incredibly kind of complex research processes that you're using to create what I think of as these lines of almost matrilineal descent that you're tracing. Barbara, you with these sculpted feminine forms, giving them maybe some agency and realism that they were denied by their original male creators. And then Leslie, you're kind of literally looking at the matrilineal lines of descent in terms of researching your own ancestry. And I mean, of course, there's lots of formal lines in both of your works. You see that very obviously in Leslie's. Before we started in the official webinar, Barbara said wrinkles are lines. And honestly, I hadn't even thought about that, but it's to think of it formally in that way is really fascinating as well. So I hope that we can just, dig in a little bit more. I'm interested in the kind of delicate balance that both of you strike between the personal autobiography, the kind of exploration of the exigencies of your own bodies and skin in relation to exploring these much broader, big, weighty issues of history and identity of different community groups. It's really powerful that both of you use yourselves, in Leslie, in your research, Barbara, in literally inserting your fragmented body into the work. But I imagine that's also a really vulnerable making process to kind of open oneself up like that. I would just be curious to hear more about how you think about your use of yourself in your own work, whether it kind of starts with from a place of genuine curiosity about the self and then kind of radiates outward to the greater scheme of history from there, or whether it starts with bigger questions of history and then you use yourself as kind of test subject because that's the material available. Have you ever felt discomfort with the work? Can it be hard to share in that way? Any way you want to take that would be fine, but I'd love to hear more about it.
Okay, I'll kind of jump in with the idea of that kind of a line that connects me to art history. I'm going to tell a little story that where the work actually started. I was in Amsterdam and visiting the Rijksmuseum, and I started drawing from one of Rembrandt's paintings, his face, in particular his eyes. And he had used himself as a model for one of the people in the painting. And I was struck by his honesty. And it just really made me wonder. I mean, that was the starting place where I started to wonder, well, if you made self-portraits, how could you be really honest? And how would you do that in the 21st century? So the other thing, just as a little aside, what interested me was that when I was drawing his eyes, they seemed very familiar. And I realized that his eye and my eye were similar in that we both had this fold at the edge. So just pleased me to think that I had a connection with Rembrandt, that I had his eye. And so I just literally started, I pasted part of his face on my face, and then I pasted it again on a marble statue, and that wasn't enough somehow. And so it took me a while to realize that I needed to use my skin. And one of the things that I didn't know how to do anything in Photoshop, just the basic stuff. And so the whole process of learning how to take photos of my neck and my hands and my arms to use became a real discovery and a real learning process, because I had to manipulate it. But I began to, there was an objectivity in doing that, so that I was kind of removed from it being my body. It just became this material, this sculptural material that I had to learn to use, to bend, to shape, to warp, to make into this drapery. And that kind of objectivity made it less vulnerable for me to use my body. I was amused by it, to tell you the truth. I found them to be pretty funny, witty, at least, you know, this idea that I was trying to take on these different personas and then using my skin as drapery material just struck me as humorous. And so there was that part of it that made it less vulnerable. And I have to say that it took me a while to realize what I was doing. That is the significance of it, the fact that I was representing aging women, because for me at first, I was just creating this kind of self-portrait. And I think it was maybe when I got into doing the mythological characters that I began to realize the feminist component that was there, and the opportunity to take that ability to twist the meaning, the original meaning. There must be hundreds of Leda and the Swan sculptures. And that's because she's being raped. And so it was a popular subject for male sculptors to use and collectors that wanted it in their collections. And so some of them are actually quite explicit. And so I just find that, so the parts of my research led me to rethink some of the sculpture that I was using, and to look into more than just oh, this is an interesting pose. So I'll just leave it there for a while.
I love the story of, picturing you sitting with Rembrandt's work and drawing it, and across these centuries, having finding this connection and presence, and recognition of your relatedness, it's great.
Yeah, it was quite an experience, actually, to have that. And and also, the chutzpah of telling myself I had Rembrandt's eyes, so or the arrogance.
Leslie, did you want to talk about this in relation to any of your own work? I was struck by when, Barbara's talking about how initially she was making a self-portrait, and then it really only later kind of, she saw the full scope of this as, a portrait that had all of this feminist traction, essentially. And Leslie, it sounds like your work really came from a place of mourning and grief, which I don't think I fully realized when I was initially delving in. And then it became, about this pernicious legacy of white supremacy. It became these, questions related to race. I think both of you are asking really interesting questions about who deserves to be seen. But I wondered if you wanted to comment at all on that kind of, using oneself and one's own family in the work, and how that process felt for you.
Yeah, well, yeah, no, it definitely does stem from a process of grieving and mourning. And perhaps a rather complex grief. And a kind of a complicated, past, I guess. But yeah, it, and then the way you saw, I think that the way it led from something very personal, like those, it's still hard for me to show and talk about those very autobiographical collages. They feel so personal. But then though they moved into this very political or more political series of work that, I should say too that that the very personal collages, the death of my mother was this very, personal event that was obviously very formative to the work, but so was the fact that, when I started those collages, it was right around the time that Obama had been elected. And then I had been working on those collages, but even other related work, subsequent work that, in this entire body of work, I've been working on it for a while, and then it became the Trump presidency. And so just, throughout these very different time periods and zeitgeists, if you will. So I had a lot of these questions, throughout my life about identity, but I always brushed them aside, and I thought they were not really that urgent. I didn't want to ever make the subject of my artwork my identity struggle. It was like, it wasn't, I thought there were far more urgent things going on in the world, but, and that visibly, far more urgent challenges that visibly Black people contend with. And I didn't want to, focus the work on myself. But at the same time, I felt resolved and committed that this was just some work that I had to do, that I had to get through and get beyond, so that I could forge this new identity, or to understand what that would be. And all this was, coincident with this change in zeitgeist. And I have felt very vulnerable about it. And I never, growing up in my family, we never talked about race very much. As I said, in my schooling, I didn't have a vocabulary, and it's felt a little bit like entering a landmine. And so I have felt very vulnerable about it. But yeah, and just what else did you say about the what else, the matrilineal, or maybe feminist foremothers, or I think also, I know you also, Paula, talked about the role of history and the archive.
Yeah, the questions I sent, which I don't think our audience has heard those, but I'm definitely interested in the role of kind of the archive and mining history in both of your work, for sure.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you picked up on that, because that when I zoom out, and I sort of zoom out and see sort of some of the procedures and the approaches that I've been taking in terms of work, in terms of like going into, finding those photographs of my mother and her personal archive, family photos, and then finding that document on the internet, which is in a library at Truman State University in Missouri in a special collections, and contacting that library to request a higher quality copy. And and so and then that, working with that chart, and then reading and thinking about the role of the library and as a space for research, perhaps exhibition, and just the idea of tapping into these different archives, which is, for me, was a shift, because my training is as a painter, although I've been more of an interdisciplinary painter, and sort of questioning the boundaries where painting might begin and end, or how painting might be might challenge those boundaries of the stretched canvas. So moving as a painter, though, to working more with words and language is wonderful, and other times it's so like pulling teeth too. But because I think, I mean, I fantasize that I'm actually writing a memoir. I think I've been working with visual memoir, but I fantasize about writing an actual memoir. Maybe I've begun it, but I think, oh my God, it's so hard. So, anyway, I don't know what else.
Well, I mean, I love the way you've made visible this, this research, your mother's archive, to which we might not otherwise have access. And so it would be kind of lost to the ashes of history. And then it strikes me that, Barbara is kind of making a speculative archive. I love the moment, Barbara, where you say, you imagine these photographs in like a book about 19th century art history, and then there it is, as though it was always that way. And so I think asking those questions, well, what could this history have looked like? Those are really powerful questions. But speaking of questions, there are a number of them in the Q&A, and I want to make sure that we get to some audience questions. So I'm just going to go back to these in the order that I think they were put in here. So there's a couple to each of you. The first one from Morgan is for Leslie. Leslie, some of your work seem to be the result of using patterns to create unexpected outcomes. Have you ever created work using this process that you were not pleased with or did not meet your expectations?
Oh, sure. The patterns I think that you've seen just kind of emerged. I didn't really set about initially with the intention of making patterns. I work in a very process-oriented way. I just sort of learn by doing. I follow, my intuition. I follow the work where it leads, and this idea of pattern, or these iterations of patterns, emerged. And trying to think if some of them didn't always kind of work or succeed as patterns. But I will say, that some of them, like the one with the sort of undulating mosaic-like one, I only showed the paper cut one, all hand cut. It was very labor intensive to do that. I also made a 3-dimensional relief piece with wood shims, longer wood shims, and oil paint based on that paper piece, the fluidity with the mosaic piece running through it. So that pattern in that case was, pre-planned, if you will. It was like creating a painting from a study, from a drawing. Does that answer your question, or could I?
I thought it was a pretty comprehensive answer. We'll go on to the next one, and then if Morgan wants to chime in, they can do so.
Okay.
So the next one from Katie is for Barbara. Barbara, how has making these self-portraits changed or not changed how you feel about aging and wrinkled skin?
It certainly changed the way I thought about wrinkled skin, because I said in my talk that I find it both repulsive and fascinating, and that's true. But I find it interesting. I mean, I think this is what artists do, is like help us to hold two opposing ideas in our head and maybe kind of flip back and forth between them that I can go from thinking it's really gross, but mostly I'm thinking of it in terms of what other people are seeing. Okay, it's not so gross to me anymore. I mean, I'm 89, so it's like you have to accept.
Wow.
You have to accept aging, or else you'd be miserable, So I do think the work has helped. I guess that I have always sort of regarded aging with a certain sense of humor, and that, as I said, I find humor in the work that I'm doing. I find it to be humorous to put my face on this sculpture and dress it in my wrinkled skin. I don't know. I think
I just was gonna jump in and say, I always think it's wonderful when there can be humor in your work, in art. And I love the performative aspect of that.
well, that, it began to be a great deal of fun to do that, because at first I would just use sort of any picture of myself, but then I had to start taking photos that would fit in. And so I had to, start like acting from my own camera, different expressions that I could use. And so it was very challenging as far as the process goes, because like you, I learn as I'm doing.
Mhm.
I didn't know how to do any of this. And it was like a kind of determination to figure this out. How could I do it, and how could I keep improving it? Because the first ones were very primitive in the way that I manipulated the skin in Photoshop. Oh my God, they're awful. Very, very primitive, like I say, because I didn't know what I was doing, so it took me a while to figure out the tools. Yeah, I'll stop there.
As someone who is not an adept Photoshop user, I just have to express my admiration for you teaching yourself to use that tool.
Yes.
I'm going to skip around a little because I want to get to a question that is for both of you. So this is from Sherry Wellman. So for both Barbara and Leslie, might you both address the potential of visibility and invisibility? Leslie, I was struck in the hand-drawn 1932 diagram that the white column had no drawing. It becomes a contradiction of white as the absence of all color, contradicted in traditional color theory. We don't need to picture whiteness because it is the default, a given. Barbara, I was struck by your agency as an older woman, bringing old women into focus for us to confront us with the inevitability of aging. Is there power, though, in invisibility or in making what we can't or won't see manifest? Aging becomes a space of great potential, a liberation from the constraints of beauty and youth, a capacity to take off your skin and conceive of it as a costume to assert your vitality and enduring wit, perhaps.
Wow, that's a really complicated and wonderful question. Is there agency in being invisible? Am I kind of summarizing that in a way?
Yeah, is there power in
Power
invisibility
in being invisible?
or in making what we can't see or won't see manifest? And it's in the Q&A if you want to read it, because I know it's a lot with me just reading it. And I believe Sherry Wellman is an art historian, and she actually, I believe, works on and writes about aging in her work.
Yeah, I guess I haven't really thought about that. Is there power in being invisible? Maybe. Maybe for the body to be invisible, but as a person, I mean, I guess I'm just not sure. I think we all want to be visible. And truthfully, what annoys me most about aging has nothing to do with my body. It has to do with condescension. The worst thing to happen to you, to me, really, is to be condescended to because of my age. And believe me, it happens all the time. So that in some sense, it's not so much as I'm invisible as I am grouped. I think I'm part of aging group, an aging woman that you can call honey or sweetie, dear. And 30 years ago, you have never have called me any of those things. So it's, and I don't know if that's, I think it might be invisibility as an individual and becoming part of this group of elderly people that we just sort of lump together. They're the elderly, so we have to treat them in a certain way.
So in response to Charlotte, yeah, visibility and invisibility. Yeah, I thought that was also ironic that no portrait was needed. On the far right there of the chart. No portrait was needed. And I just a side note, I Googled the name of the person the name is of the person is included faintly in the chart who did those ink drawings, but I could find nothing on that person in Google. And so they've become invisible in terms of our Google and internet search engines. But invisibility and visibility is certainly a theme that seems to be pervasive, but I have certainly felt invisible, or aspects of myself have felt invisible, depending on the context or the situation. When I was about 8 years, 6, 7, 8 years old, my parents sat me down and told me they wanted to tell me that I was part Black, and my father was white and my mother mixed, and they told me I was an octoroon. this would have been in the early 60s. It was meaning, 1/8 Black, and, doing these elaborate calculations and so on. And so, but I could never figure it out because my grandparents were both mixed race. Their parents were both mixed race. At some point, it would have gone back to where one was Black and one was white, and it, stemming from slavery. And so it was never a clear-cut calculation, but it really didn't matter, which is what I discovered gazing at that chart. But I certainly have felt invisible when I've been in the room with people who are talking and perhaps saying racist comments. That harkens back to Adrian Piper's card that she printed up and would pass out in bars, and she'd hand it to people, and the card said, "I know you didn't realize when you just made that racist remark that I'm Black, but and she said, I would prefer that you," whatever, I can't remember the card word for word, but she had this card that she would pass out. So there's that aspect of being invisible. And that relates as well to the notion of passing, people who, that Netflix series based on the novel by Nella Larson, also written during the Harlem Renaissance, just came out. And the novel of the story of two light-skinned Black women, one who passes for white and the other who does not, who chooses not to. And, my mother never chose to pass for white. She probably could have, but she never chose to do that. And but there might have been instances where she might have situationally passed, or maybe just decided not to, pass out a card, or just remain silent or invisible. And so I've certainly been in spaces like that, but I wanted to be I think my work has been, doing the work has been a process of transformation in some ways, or a process of actualization of moving forward in your life with who you are and who you're becoming, what work you want to do, and how. And I wanted to be visible, but most of all, I wanted just to be legible, because I've always felt illegible, because of certain aspects of identity that remain not so visible. And I just also think that there's always been aspects of my work that my work is very formal, but it's also very oriented towards different, social issues, seeing the work in some ways as an instrument to be effective in some way, but at the same time, I want my cake and eat it too. I want it to be purely formal too, right? Very, very formal. But one thing I'll end on, which is it's working with this, as Paula said, a rigorous abstract language. It's not, I also want to bring portrait into the work. I've tried, I might continue to do that. But so far I'm not, I haven't completely sort of, found the most natural way yet of bringing the kind of representational imagery into the work. But it seems sort of like it, it seems like it would make sense.
I like that you say, I want to be legible. I don't think I've ever heard that used in that way before. And I really like that. I think that's an answer to the invisibility question, It's like legibility is very important, and it's powerful. It is what gives you power more than invisibility does.
More than invisibility or more than visibility?
More than invisibility.
And so do you think of that in terms of literally legible, being readable?
Well, I think metaphorically and literally, I guess I like work where there's a surprise. And I think that your work is formally beautiful and it attracts us to want to get closer. And then when we find out that there's more to it, like you read the title, and then you have to go back and look again. I'm all for the second look. I like that whole idea that that a work can produce that desire to take a second look and to understand more about it. And that's to me like a significant, it's a significant part of your work and of being an artist, really, is that we want that so that it's not a superficial glance.
Right.
So there's more to it here. And I don't know, it's important to me. And I think it's an important part of your work.
I think the thing, I haven't seen Barbara's work in person yet, but seeing it online here, the thing that makes me take a second look about your work is that first of all, there's the seamlessness of it. And then when you look closer, you realize that it is a pastiche, and those ruptures, in a sense, between within the imagery is what calls into question, what am I actually seeing, And maybe for younger people, they're more used to that. I'm still sort of conditioned by the seamlessness of the photograph and believing it. But I think there's still this kind of rupture that takes place, which calls things into question in your pastiche.
Yes, well, disruption is what I'm after almost always in my work. It's if it doesn't have that, then it doesn't interest me. I can't stay with it. It's got to have that kind of disruption.
I think both of you really disrupt a lot of kind of grandmaster narratives of history and of visual culture. I was thinking about Sherry's question and that power of invisibility. And, I think that I can see where power would come in feeling like you were liberated from the constraints of a gaze, a surveilling gaze, a male gaze. To be looked at can be relentless and exhausting and even violent. To feel like one is being examined for someone else's delectation. And so I think, in your work, Barbara, it's visibility, but on your terms, and you really, you do it in a disruptive way. And I think, Leslie, thinking about, I think that tension between visibility and invisibility and what you allow us to see in the work and how much of it just gets subsumed into this formal language. It's there, it's in the DNA of the work, but it's below the surface. And I think that, so again, both of you are revealing so much of yourselves, but in ways where you retain agency. And I think that's very powerful. There are other great questions in the chat, but we are at almost 7:45. And I see that Lisa has turned on her camera, which suggests that we are coming to a close. So I will stop talking.
Oh, this has been so wonderful. Thank you so much for tonight's conversation. The artists, all of the work in the show actually is really deserving and calling for a second look. So I hope that those of you that are able will come visit the show in person in the Bruce Gallery before it closes. And we are having a closing reception on Friday, February 4th. I really appreciate the plans that I know that Brad Patullo, who is one of the professors here teaching animation, is going to be giving another one of these Wensinars in January on the 20th with our alumni, Sohila Azadi, who is a performance artist, studied animation here, and also Martha Gorski, who was a professor of animation here now out in San Francisco. So that they're both in the show, the line show, and that will be in January. I also want to acknowledge the funding that supports these. The art department itself, Erie Arts and Culture helps us, and the student government here at Edinburgh University does quite a big job helping us out as well. So I thank you all for tonight. We have recorded this. It will be posted as soon as we can get it done. And thank you. And also thank you so much for your questions tonight. And I really appreciate all of you taking the time to be with us. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Good night.